There was once a bishop inside the Vatican whose influence surpassed men who had spent twice as many years climbing the same powerful ladder. He did not walk through the cracked streets where ordinary people struggled every day. Instead, he moved through the flawless marble halls of the Apostolic Palace, surrounded by history, privilege, and authority. He did not sit at tables with the forgotten, the suffering, or the poor. His evenings were spent beside presidents, diplomats, powerful cardinals, and the financial elite of the world. He controlled access to the highest offices of the Catholic Church. He influenced the movement of enormous financial resources. He had his hands on sensitive information that few people outside the inner circle ever saw. For more than 2 decades, his quiet decisions carried the weight of law. Inside the Vatican, his influence was almost impossible to challenge. Rome respected him. The powerful depended on him, and many believed he could never be removed. But then came a new pope. A pope who looked at the Vatican not as a palace of power, but as a place meant to serve the wounded people of the world. And that pope made a decision nobody expected. He removed the man who believed he was untouchable. He stripped away his influence. He sent him away from the center of power. He was effectively exiled. But why? Why would Pope Leo XIV take such a dramatic step against one of the most powerful figures inside the church? The answer was far deeper than politics. It was about something that had been forgotten behind centuries of tradition, bureaucracy, and authority. It was about the difference between controlling a church and actually serving one. Pope Leo XIII had only recently taken his place in the chair of St. Peter, but from the very beginning, his leadership style was impossible to ignore. He was not interested in simply maintaining the old systems. He wanted renewal. He wanted a church that moved beyond paperwork, titles, and endless procedures, a church that reached people where they were suffering, a church that walked beside the forgotten instead of watching them from a distance. To Leo XIII, leadership was not about sitting behind massive wooden desks surrounded by documents. Leadership meant stepping into the pain of ordinary people. It meant listening. It meant serving. That vision placed him directly against the powerful structure that had protected men like Archbishop Silas Vance for years. Vance had spent decades mastering the Vatican system. He understood every rule, every process, every hidden connection. He knew how decisions moved through the church and how easily they could be slowed, redirected, or stopped. For years, he had built an empire of influence, not through public speeches or dramatic displays of power, but through quiet control. He was not a man who demanded attention. He did not need to. His position gave him everything he needed. Archbishop Silas Vance was not an ordinary church leader. He had been carefully prepared for greatness from a young age. Born into a respected family in the American Northeast, he possessed extraordinary intelligence, an impressive memory, and a natural talent for understanding people. He remembered names, he remembered relationships, he remembered favors, and he understood the invisible networks that shaped decisions behind closed doors. His rise through the church hierarchy was remarkably fast. By the time he reached the Vatican's highest administrative circles, he already knew exactly how the system worked, and more importantly, he knew how to control it. Vance believed stability was everything. In his mind, the church was a massive institution that could collapse without strong management. He believed rules protected the church. He believed procedures prevented chaos. He believed someone had to guard the gates. And for 14 years, he became that gatekeeper. He survived the final years of Pope Benedict's leadership. He remained powerful throughout Pope Francis's entire papacy. While Pope Francis often spoke about reaching people on the margins of society, Vance focused on protecting the structure at the center. He controlled the movement of documents reaching the Pope's desk. He influenced appointments. He had the ability to slow reforms simply by allowing them to disappear inside endless committees and reviews. When local dioceses requested greater independence, his office often found reasons to delay. When reform-minded leaders pushed for major changes, Vance knew exactly which procedures could slow them down. He was not openly cruel. He was not a villain. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The institution became more important than the mission. The system became more important than the people. And the church that was supposed to be close to suffering humanity began to feel distant. Vance had become the ultimate guardian of the walls. But Pope Leo XIII believed those walls had become too high. When Leo XIV appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, the world immediately noticed something different. He spoke less about preserving power. He spoke more about restoring compassion. He did not see the church as an organization that needed protection. He saw it as a wounded body that needed healing. Within his first months, Leo began demanding greater transparency. He questioned financial practices. He reached out directly to local bishops. He bypassed traditional channels that had controlled communication for years, and Archbishop Vance watched carefully. At first, he was not worried. He had seen reform movements before. He had watched powerful people come and go. He believed that eventually the new pope would understand the complexity of governing a global church. He believed Leo would eventually need him. But Vance misunderstood one important thing. Pope Leo XIV was not trying to manage the old system. He was trying to transform it. For months, Archbishop Silas Vance watched the actions of Pope Leo XIV with quiet confidence. He believed he understood how the Vatican worked. He had spent decades studying its traditions, mastering its procedures, and building relationships that reached every corner of the institution. In his mind, every new pope eventually faced the same reality. The idealism of the beginning would fade, the complicated machinery of the church would remain, and eventually, even the strongest leaders would need experienced hands like his. But Pope Leo XIII was not interested in preserving the machinery. He was interested in asking a much more uncomfortable question. What happens when the machinery begins to forget the people it was created to serve? That question would soon change everything. The moment that shocked the Vatican did not come with a public argument. There was no dramatic confrontation, no angry speech, no public accusation. Instead, it happened quietly inside the walls of the Apostolic Palace. According to those close to the Pope, Leo XIII did not call Archbishop Vance into a long meeting. He did not negotiate. He did not engage in the careful political conversations that usually surrounded major Vatican decisions. Instead, he sent a simple, handwritten message, a message that would completely change the future of one of the most powerful men in Rome. The instruction was clear. Archbishop Silas Vance was to leave his position immediately. He was not being transferred to another powerful office. He was not being rewarded with a prestigious diplomatic assignment. He was not being moved into another position where he could continue influencing decisions from behind the scenes. He was being sent away from Rome, away from power, away from the center of influence he had spent decades building. The man who once controlled access to the highest offices of the church was suddenly removed from the very place where his influence mattered most. The reaction inside the Vatican was immediate: shock, disbelief, fear. Many cardinals and officials who had depended on Vance for years struggled to understand what had happened. How could a new pope remove one of the most powerful administrators in Rome without causing chaos? How could someone who had become so deeply connected to the system simply disappear from it? The answer revealed the heart of Pope Leo XIV's leadership. He believed the church had forgotten something essential. The church was never meant to become a fortress protecting itself. It was meant to become a refuge for those who were suffering. It was not created to protect the comfortable. It was created to reach the broken. And Leo believed that when leaders become more focused on protecting their authority than serving others, something has gone deeply wrong. For years, Vance had measured success through organization, through efficiency, through control, through perfectly maintained systems. But Leo measured success differently. He measured it by compassion, by presence, by whether the suffering person on the street felt seen. The poor were not statistics. The forgotten were not numbers. The suffering were not problems to be managed. They were human beings who needed love, dignity, and action. And that difference in vision placed Vance directly in the path of change. But the final reason behind Vance's removal was not revealed immediately. The turning point came from a crisis that never should have been delayed. It began with a desperate message from a small, struggling diocese located in a war-torn region of the world. Violence had suddenly increased. Families had lost their homes. Thousands of people were living in freezing conditions with little food, medicine, or protection. The local bishop sent an urgent request to Rome. He was not asking for luxury. He was not asking for political support. He was asking for emergency humanitarian funds, money that could provide warmth, food, medical assistance, a chance for people to survive. It was a moment when every second mattered. The request reached Archbishop Vance's office, and there it stopped. Not because the need was unclear, not because the suffering was exaggerated, but because Vance's department discovered a procedural issue, a small technical problem in the paperwork. According to the system, more reviews were needed, more approvals, more documents, more signatures, more time. To Vance, the process had to be followed. Rules existed for a reason. The system could not be ignored. But while the paperwork moved slowly through endless channels, real people continued to suffer. Children remained cold. Families remained hungry. Lives remained at risk. Pope Leo XIV did not discover the situation through official reports. He discovered it because he did something different, something Archbishop Vance rarely did. He picked up the phone. He called the local bishop directly. Late at night, Leo listened as the exhausted bishop explained what was happening. He heard the pain. He heard the desperation. He heard that help had been requested, but delayed because of administrative procedures. And in that moment, something became painfully clear to the Pope. And the problem was not simply one delayed request. The problem was a mindset where protecting the process had become more important than protecting people. For Pope Leo XIV, that was the moment everything changed. He realized that a perfectly organized institution could still fail its mission. A machine could run flawlessly and still produce nothing meaningful if it ignored the people it was designed to help. The church could have beautiful buildings, ancient traditions, thousands of rules, But if it could not respond to someone crying for help, then it had forgotten its purpose. And that realization led to one of the most dramatic decisions of Leo's early leadership. The removal of Archbishop Silas Vance was not about revenge. It was not about humiliation. It was not about destroying a man. It was about forcing the Vatican to remember what true service looked like. When Vance received the final order, he was instructed to leave Rome and return to a small, struggling diocese far away from the world of power and influence, a place where nobody cared about his connections, a place where nobody knew his reputation, a place where his titles meant almost nothing. There, he would face something he had avoided for decades, the reality of ordinary human suffering. And for the first time in many years, Archbishop Silas Vance would no longer be able to manage suffering from a distance. He would have to stand beside it. The destination chosen for Archbishop Silas Vance was not an accident. Pope Leo XIV could have sent him somewhere comfortable. He could have assigned him to a prestigious diplomatic role in one of the world's major cities. He could have placed him somewhere surrounded by influence, respect, and familiar faces, but he did not. Instead, Leo sent him to a forgotten corner of his own country, a struggling diocese where the churches were aging, the communities were shrinking, and many families were fighting simply to survive. There were no powerful diplomats waiting for him, no wealthy officials asking for his opinion, no endless meetings inside grand marble halls. There were only ordinary people, people who were hungry, people who were lonely, people who needed someone to listen. For a man who had spent decades controlling the most complicated systems of the Vatican, this was a complete change of reality. In Rome, his decisions affected thousands of people. His office was surrounded by influence. His schedule was filled with important meetings. His name opened doors. But here, his name meant almost nothing. Nobody cared about the connections he once had. Nobody cared about the powerful people who respected him. Nobody cared about the authority he once carried inside the Vatican. The people of this small community had one simple question. Would he actually be there for them? His departure from Rome was quiet. There was no farewell ceremony, no grand celebration, no official tribute recognizing his decades of service. The man who once walked through the Vatican surrounded by assistants and officials left almost unnoticed. He packed his belongings inside the same walls where he had once held tremendous influence, the marble floors, the ancient paintings, the powerful offices, the world he had known for so long. All of it was behind him. When he finally walked through the great doors of the Apostolic Palace for the last time, he was no longer the powerful administrator everyone feared. He was simply Silas Vance, an aging priest carrying a suitcase, a man about to enter a world he had spent his entire career trying to understand from a distance. Before his departure, a young Vatican official delivered one final envelope. Inside was a handwritten message from Pope Leo XIV. It was not a long explanation. It was not a political statement. It was only one sentence, a sentence that would stay with Vance for years. You spent your life protecting the walls of the church. Now go and tend to the wounds of her people. Those words were not written to destroy him. They were written to challenge him, to force him to rediscover something he had slowly forgotten. The difference between protecting an institution and caring for the people inside it. When Vance arrived at his new diocese, reality hit him immediately. There was no impressive cathedral waiting, no crowd of important figures welcoming him, no cameras, no celebrations, only a small, aging church surrounded by a struggling neighborhood. The building needed repairs. The streets around it carried the scars of years of hardship. The local community was filled with families struggling with unemployment, addiction, poverty, and loneliness. This was not the world of Vatican politics. This was the world of human pain. The first few weeks were difficult, very difficult. For the first time in decades, Vance had no powerful office, no team of assistants, no staff managing his every request, no endless flow of information crossing his desk. His new office was small, his furniture was old, his phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was not a cardinal calling. It was usually a volunteer asking for help, a family needing food, an elderly person needing transportation, a struggling person looking for someone who would simply listen. At first, Vance struggled with the silence. He had spent years surrounded by important conversations. Now, the only voices around him were the voices of people who were hurting. He had always believed he understood the church. He knew its laws, he knew its structure, he knew its traditions. But now he was discovering something uncomfortable. Knowing the church was not the same as knowing its people. The first major test came during a brutal winter. A powerful storm struck the city unexpectedly. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Heavy snow covered the streets. Many people were trapped without proper heating. During the middle of the night, Vance was suddenly awakened by loud knocking at the door of the rectory. Standing outside was a desperate volunteer from a local homeless shelter. The person's face showed exhaustion and fear. The shelter's old heating system had completely failed. Inside were dozens of people, families, children, elderly residents, all trapped in the freezing cold. For a brief moment, the old Silas Vance returned. His mind immediately went to procedures, emergency requests, official approvals, financial reports. He thought about the proper steps, the forms that needed to be completed, the meetings that would need to happen, the system he had trusted for his entire career. But then he looked at the volunteer standing in front of him, a person who was not asking for paperwork, a person who was asking for help. And suddenly, Pope Leo's words came back to him. Go and tend to the wounds of her people. There was no time for committees, no time for approvals, no time for another review. People were freezing. So Vance did something he had rarely done before. He acted. He put on his winter coat. He stepped into the storm. And he walked directly into the suffering he once managed from behind a desk. That night, the former gatekeeper of the Vatican did something nobody expected. He carried blankets. He served food. He helped move families through the snow. He held the hands of frightened children. He stood beside people who had been ignored by society. There were no cameras, no powerful witnesses, no political advantage, only a man and the people who needed him. And for the first time in his entire priesthood, Silas Vance was not managing the church. He was finally living it. That night in the freezing storm became the first crack in the walls Silas Vance had built around himself for decades. The man who had once controlled decisions from the heart of the Vatican was now standing in the middle of a desperate shelter, surrounded by people who did not know his title, his influence, or his history. They only knew one thing. He was there. For years, Vance had believed that leadership meant making the right decisions from the right place. He believed order, structure, and control were the foundations of a strong church. But as he carried exhausted families through the snow and watched frightened children searching for warmth, he began to understand something he had missed for most of his career. Sometimes people do not need another decision. Sometimes they simply need someone to show up. The story of Archbishop Silas Vance's new life slowly began spreading beyond the small diocese. Officially, the Vatican described his move as a normal reassignment. There were no dramatic statements and no public explanations. But those who understood the inner workings of the church knew that something much deeper had happened. A man who had spent decades protecting the institution was now learning how to serve the people. His new daily life was completely different from the world he had left behind. In Rome, his days were filled with meetings, reports, negotiations, and discussions about policies that affected millions. Now, his mornings began with simple conversations, a visit to an elderly person living alone, a phone call from a struggling family, a request from a local charity that needed support. The problems were smaller in scale, but they were much more personal. There were names attached to every struggle. There were faces behind every need. At first, the change was uncomfortable. Vance was used to having people come to him. Now he had to go to them. He had to walk through neighborhoods where buildings were falling apart. He had to enter homes where families were choosing between paying bills and buying food. He had to sit beside people whose lives had been forgotten by society. There was no distance anymore. No paperwork between him and human suffering. No office door separating him from reality. Then came another moment that changed him forever. It happened on a cold morning when the local food pantry ran out of supplies. The pantry was not just a charity. For hundreds of families, it was their last source of support. Parents depended on it. Elderly residents depended on it. People who had lost jobs or faced unexpected hardships depended on it. But that morning, the shelves were empty. The volunteers were exhausted. And outside, a long line of people waited in silence. The coordinator of the food pantry came to Vance's office with tears in her eyes. She explained that they had nothing left to give. The old Silas Vance would have reacted differently. He would have asked for financial reports. He would have requested a full review of the situation. He would have wanted proper documentation before making a decision. That was how he had operated for decades. But something inside him had changed. He looked at the woman standing before him. He thought about the families waiting outside. He thought about the hungry children. And for the first time, the answer did not come from a rule book. It came from compassion. Vance stood up, put on his coat, and walked out into the cold. He did not write a report. He did not schedule a meeting. He did not wait for approval. He went directly to the grocery stores in the area and used his own savings to purchase whatever food he could carry. Bread, milk, canned goods, basic supplies. Things that many people take for granted, but that meant everything to those who had nothing. For the rest of the day, Archbishop Silas Vance stood behind the counter of the food pantry. The same man who once managed enormous resources inside the Vatican was now handing groceries to struggling families with his own hands. He looked into their eyes. He listened to their stories. He heard about lost jobs, broken homes, medical struggles, and years of hardship, and something inside him finally became clear. He had spent years managing the church, but he had not fully understood how to become part of it. That evening, when Vance returned to his small room, his expensive shoes were covered in mud and water, his hands were tired from carrying heavy boxes, his body was exhausted. but his heart felt something it had not felt in years. Peace. A kind of peace that no position, no title, and no amount of influence had ever given him. For decades, he had protected the structure of faith. Now, he was finally discovering its heartbeat. From that day forward, the people of the diocese began seeing a completely different man. The powerful Vatican administrator slowly disappeared. In his place was a shepherd, a man who walked the streets, a man who visited hospitals, a man who sat with prisoners and listened to their stories, a man who no longer measured his importance by how many people followed his orders, but by how many people felt loved because he was there. The transformation of Silas Vance eventually reached Rome. The same cardinals and officials who once feared his influence now heard stories they could hardly believe. The former gatekeeper of the Vatican was sweeping floors at shelters, serving meals, visiting forgotten communities, doing the very things he had once considered the responsibility of others. But Pope Leo XIV was not surprised. He had never sent Vance away to destroy him. He had sent him away to help him rediscover his purpose. The transformation of Archbishop Silas Vance was not a temporary emotional moment. It became a completely new way of living. The man who once measured his days by meetings, documents, and institutional decisions now measured his days by the people who needed him most. His calendar was no longer filled with diplomatic conversations and financial discussions. Instead, it was filled with hospital visits, conversations with struggling families, and moments spent beside people who had been forgotten by society. He no longer walked through the streets as a powerful Vatican official. He walked as a shepherd among his people. He learned the names of the homeless men who slept near the train station. He remembered the elderly residents who had no family nearby. He listened to single parents struggling to provide for their children. He discovered the hidden pain that existed in ordinary neighborhoods, pain that could never be understood through reports or statistics. The old Silas Vance would have studied these problems from behind a desk. The new Silas Vance stepped directly into them. He no longer wanted to manage suffering from a distance. He wanted to share the burden. Months passed, and the people of the struggling diocese began to see a completely different man. They no longer saw the former Vatican administrator who had once controlled powerful offices in Rome. They saw someone who showed up when people were hurting, someone who sat beside hospital beds, someone who visited struggling families, someone who walked through dangerous neighborhoods without fear, someone who treated every person, regardless of their status, as someone worthy of dignity. The title that once gave him power slowly became less important. The service he provided became everything. Then another crisis tested the man he had become. A community of struggling immigrant families living in an abandoned apartment building suddenly faced eviction. The building was declared unsafe, and the electricity and water were shut off during the coldest days of winter. Dozens of families were left frightened and desperate. Children were freezing. Parents had nowhere else to go. The old Silas Vance would have immediately returned to his former habits. He would have prepared legal documents, contacted officials, and waited for the correct procedures to move forward. But that man no longer existed. The new Silas Vance did not wait behind a desk. He did not send someone else. He did not ask for permission. Late at night, he borrowed an old parish vehicle and drove directly to the abandoned building. With a small group of volunteers, he carried blankets, food, heaters, and medical supplies to the families trapped inside. The same man who once controlled decisions from the highest offices of the Vatican was now walking through dark hallways carrying supplies with his own hands. When local authorities arrived and questioned his presence inside the building, they expected resistance. They expected him to use his authority. They expected him to mention his position. But Vance simply looked at them and said that helping people in need was the only responsibility that mattered in that moment. He was no longer protecting his reputation. He was protecting human lives. The story of that night traveled far beyond the small community. People across the church heard about the former Vatican power figure who had become a servant among the forgotten. Those who once feared his influence struggled to recognize him. The man who once guarded the doors of power was now opening doors for those who had none. The man who once controlled resources was now giving his own time, energy, and strength. And Pope Leo XIV watched all of this unfold with quiet confidence, because he had never wanted to destroy Silas Vance. He wanted to save the part of him that had been buried beneath years of power and responsibility. Years later, when a journalist asked Archbishop Vance if he missed the Vatican, the grand buildings, and the influence he once had, he smiled quietly. He looked around at the small parish hall where volunteers were serving meals to struggling families. He looked at the people around him, the people who had changed his life, and he explained that he had spent many years believing he understood the church. But he only truly discovered the church when he was forced to leave the place where he had power and enter the places where people were suffering. That was the greatest lesson of his life. He had spent decades protecting the walls of the church, but he finally understood that the church was never meant to be hidden behind walls. It was meant to walk among people, to stand beside the broken, to comfort the forgotten, to serve those who had nowhere else to turn. The story of Pope Leo XIV's decision was not simply about removing one powerful man, it was about reminding an entire institution of its true purpose. Authority was never meant to create distance. True leadership was never meant to seek comfort. A shepherd does not stand above the people, a shepherd walks with them. By removing the most powerful administrator in Rome, Pope Leo XIV sent a message that reached far beyond the Vatican. No title was greater than service, no position was greater than compassion, no tradition could ever replace love. The Church could not survive by only protecting its history. It had to live its mission. And that was the unexpected miracle of Archbishop Silas Vance. The man who believed he held power in his hands discovered that real power was not found in offices, documents, or influence. Real power was found in helping someone who had nothing. It was found in carrying a child through a snowstorm. It was found in feeding a hungry family. It was found in sitting beside someone who felt forgotten. The man who once stood at the center of the Vatican eventually found what he had been searching for his entire life. Not authority, not recognition, not control, but purpose. Because sometimes the greatest transformation does not happen when someone gains more power. Sometimes it happens when they finally learn how to let it go. And that was the lesson Pope Leo XIII wanted the world to understand. The Church does not belong to those who protect its walls. It belongs to those who open its doors, to those who serve, to those who love, to those who remember that behind every statistic is a human soul waiting to be seen. And in the end, Archbishop Silas Vance discovered the truth he had forgotten. A person does not find God by standing above others. They find him by kneeling beside them. The end.